Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here.
No problem. So, Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll get started.
Yeah, look, I'm a sustainability professional. I've been working in this industry for 20 years. I'm based in Sydney, in Australia, and I've just finished publishing my first book, which is How to Build Sustainability into Business Strategy, and that is actually getting launched tomorrow, actually. So it's taken me a couple of years to write this book. I've really focused on how to make it simple for businesses to understand the opportunity of sustainability and doing better and actually turning that into a competitive advantage. So that I work with a number of companies down here across Australia, New Zealand, and in the Pacific, ranging from retail, hotel chains to infrastructure companies. So it's quite diverse, and I really enjoy helping companies push the boundaries a bit on what's possible, but actually helping them do good and be profitable at the same time.
So, what do you cover in the book?
Well, I cover the basics of I want to understand what is sustainability, and I break it down into simple, easy to understand, and in business language. Spending 20 years working in this area, there's a lot of science, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of muddling of words and so forth. So I really try to make it simple, and I broke it down to three key things that you need to understand. First of all, as a business leader, you want to be confident. So I look at confidence. So you want to actually know what are your biggest environmental impacts or social impacts? What are these big global macro issues such as maybe climate change, waste, or modern slavery? How does that relate to your business? Then I look at what commitments you need to make. And this might be taking a look at what your customers' expectations are, regulations, or you want to enter a new market. So looking at maybe you might want to set a climate target or a social benefit targets. What are you going to commit to? And then the final part is I break it down and how do you keep it consistent? So how do you actually have the governance in organizations, or how do you keep people responsible and on track? So I call it the very simple triple C framework. It's a simple, easy to read business book that's got lots of war stories from my last 20 odd years, some good case studies of global brands of what they did wrong, what they've done right, and tried to put it together in a sort of a nice, easy to understand story.
So, what's the main your main goal, your end target with the book?
Yeah, it's looking at existing and emerging leaders and trying to identify the opportunity of sustainability. And I think it's largely untapped in businesses at the moment. And this could be looking at cost savings initially. So you might want to have an energy efficiency program. To some of my clients, I'm looking at, hey, they want to actually design new products and grow into new markets. And how do I attract new customers with a more sustainable product that might resonate with a new area or new jurisdiction, new geographical area? And other clients actually use it to help retain talent and staff, especially younger generation of graduates are looking at working for companies that just don't make money, that have a good purpose as well. So I really help with that.
So, talk to us a little bit about the ESG. Like, what are the best practices for businesses?
Yeah, when you look at ESG, you break it down into environment, social, and governance. And what I look for in companies is those that have understand what their impacts are, of course, across all those areas. So, for instance, you might be doing some adverse impacts on the environment. So you want to actually understand what that is and put some controls and measures in place. And that could be setting emission reduction targets, waste targets. And then you look at the social side of things. So some of my clients work in the Pacific. So how do they help the area that they operate in? How do they help with education, meaningful employment, and helping their staff grow in that area, and they become part of that community? So what are they doing to give back to that community to make sure they have a stable workforce, but also become an employer of choice? So they're looking at how do they work with charities and partnerships and sides like that. And the other thing I look at is the governance. So who is responsible in the organization? Does it regularly, is sustainability or ESG discussed at the board level on a regular basis? What's their level of capability and understanding? How do they report on these things and matters and so forth? Is it annually or is it ad hoc? And what is their overall strategy and goal and objectives, in the short, medium, and long term?
How is it? How is that evolved over the years?
Yeah, look, it's definitely evolved. You might have heard of corporate social responsibility, or companies looking beyond profit. What's it involving now is that sort of the evolution of ESG has moved from mandatory reporting, which is coming through a lot. Actually, looking at where I look at is value creation in the businesses that I work with. So, what do we look at? How do you actually not only just comply, but how can you look at the opportunities beyond compliance? So, you're seeing those more savvy businesses are moving ahead of that curve, of that compliance curve, regulatory curve, and are actually gaining some value in that. So, you're seeing that evolution of coming into play of those that are laggards that are being dragged along with regulation, those that comply, and there's those that are few, but there's getting more companies that go ahead of regulation and look to actually seek new customers and profit from that ultimately.
What do you see companies struggle with?
Yeah, generally, there's a few things I see they struggle with. A lot is that capability. There's not many people in organizations that have experience and get the nuances between the altruistic sort of green tree hugging person in a corporate. They sort of sometimes don't gel well. So you've got to have some nuances there of actually looking at how do you work with profitability of the company and help them become more sustainable, not just keep throwing rocks at them, I suppose. You could get a bit offside. So a lot of companies are struggling with the right resourcing to do that. And a lot of other things too are confidence. Find a lot of people, especially the leaders I talk to, are generally older people in businesses, and this is a new concept to them. So they're not really confident in understanding what is actually needed and expectations and the value. So they look at it more from a risk and fear lens, whereas I'm trying to create the opportunity lens to that.
And how do you work with companies?
Yeah, ideally, you work with companies that have a immediate need. It might be a regulatory pressure or a customer pressure. I look at how they could help solve that issue. But I go in there and work, hopefully, ideally, for 2 to 3 months or even longer, sometimes a year, where I help set up that strategy. I help train and impart my knowledge. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote that book. So the book covers that simple framework that they can follow. And then I educate, train, and hopefully sometimes I help them recruit their first sustainability manager. I work with the boards to get their confidence up, help them set their first targets, help them do their first reporting, and then hopefully step back and empower them to actually carry on with that work.
What are some several strategies that companies could use?
Yeah, there's a lot of different strategies. The main one that I'd like to see is understanding your major impacts, and that could also be your opportunities. So the key foundation to a strategy is understanding what is material to your business, and you could do that by doing surveys, asking staff, customers, even government, other stakeholders around your community, and really fine tune, really drill down what matters most to your business. So it might be 2 or 3 key issues such as social and community, maybe climate and waste, and you might want to look at supply chain. But there could be 30 other things you look at, but you've got to try and nail it down to a few. Always keep in mind the other areas might bubble up, but really focus on the few key things that matter the most, and that's really core to the strategy. I sometimes get turned off when companies say, hey, we're going to solve 30, 40 different things, or of the 17 sustainable development goals. That's really unrealistic. You've got to really drill it down and focus on what matters the most and grow from there.
When it comes to investors, attracting investors for your company,
Yeah.
investors might be reluctant to
Yeah.
invest in companies when it regards to ESG, like they might think it's a low performance. What do
Yeah.
you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's generally the term ESG has got some backlash that I'm aware of. But what you've got to look at, I suppose, investors for the long term are generally need to look at this because it can turn quickly on a dime, really. If something like a massive scandal or like an oil spill or something, a big social issue, or you might find human rights violations in your supply chain, the sweatshops in Asia and so forth that might be in your supply chains. If you do not have ESG governance, you're leaving yourself exposed to even more damage around that because you're not even aware of it, you're not even looking for it. So that's what you're going to see, and that will affect the bottom line. It does affect share price as well. So ESG to me is just good governance of companies. It's understanding beyond yourself, the impact you have on society and the wider planet, and understanding that and understanding how you can mitigate those risks, and also how can you actually maybe eliminate them, but use them to your advantage as well. But you've got to have a lens across that and understand what those risks are to start with. So burying your head in the sand saying ESG is going to cost us all this money is not a viable long-term strategy.
Are there any punishment right now at the moment for people who don't comply with ESG?
Yeah, you've seen in the European Union, here in Australia, in the UK, and even in New Zealand, that there's mandatory disclosure around climate-related risks and opportunities. So companies have to start reporting on their carbon emissions and then looking at their climate risks across their supply chain, and also any opportunities that might exist. There's also modern slavery legislation coming into play, that companies here in Australia have to do a mandatory modern slavery report. These are based on turnover, so over 50 million turnover. Companies here in Australia have to do an annual report where they look at their supply chain, look at their policies, and report back on, yes, we've done this amount of work in our supply chain. Understand we haven't found any instances of modern slavery, but we're working on these things around training, education, policies, and so forth. If companies don't comply with this, there are penalties and fines that can be imposed on from different governments and jurisdictions. And also, as you mentioned before, on the flip side around ESG and investor rankings, they could lose points on certain rankings and might not be able to access some sort of green bonds or special ESG funds that might be out there as well.
So how do companies can measure their status in regards to ESG?
Yeah, first of all, there's some simple tools out there where you can look at where your rankings. There's some official rankings such as Carbon Disclosure Project, or some companies set science-based targets that are ranked. That's something you can look at. Another good way is to just use a simple diagnostic tool, which I normally do with most clients, is look at all your policies. You can rank whether you have policies around and certain targets and your governance models. You can give a sort of a ranking there, and you can look at your peers and so forth. So there's a lot you can do internally, inwardly looking first to say, hey, have we done a materiality assessment? Do we understand our biggest impacts? Have we set any targets? Do we have any policies around this? Or a really good one I like to do is ask yourself, what if this happened? What if we found an instance of modern slavery in our supply chain? What would we do? What would be our defense to that? And in some cases, they might not have anything. So that might highlight, say, a weakness in your business that you might want to correct.
With the global warming right now at the moment, what companies should be thinking about now?
Definitely measuring and reporting on your own carbon emissions, and these is described as scope 1 and 2. So quickly, scope 1 is say like the fuel you burn, like your gas and diesel. Scope 2 is as carbon emissions related to your electricity use off the grid. The other big one is actually need to start thinking about what scope 3 is, and that's emissions in your supply chain, which can be quite hard to measure. But companies need to start thinking about that, especially if you supply a larger company. They'll be asking you about your emissions because you form part of their overall scope of emissions. And if they want to set a climate target, they might have to set one across their supply chain. So you'll be captured in this sort of ecosystem of suppliers. So look at who you supply. Are they a big company? Say, for instance, Walmart have a climate target. They might be asking you, if you supply Walmart, what's the carbon emissions of your product? And also what happens end of life? Does it go to landfill? Is there a recyclability of that? These are certain things that questions will start coming up to suppliers as it moves down the supply chain.
What if when you're building your business, you're not probably doing it on purpose, but you might missing how can I say that? You're building your business, but you're not thinking too much about those kind of stuff. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, no, I fully understand. I've been in startups building a business. You're dead focused on things like cash flow and so forth around that. I would just understand your customers and what their needs are, because you might be able to help them with their, say they've set a climate target. You might have a product that might be lower carbon or might help serve them and their targets and so forth. So there's an opportunity there to look at sustainability as an opportunity. There are some simple things you could do right now is just look at things like the waste in your operations, measure your basic carbon emissions, which could be just measuring the liters of fuel you use and energy consumption, understanding what that is. You might find some savings there with energy efficiency. Some of those are quite easy, quick wins you can have. And that's a good sustainability story that helps you build momentum. So there are lots of things you can do, very easy, quick wins that can demonstrate that, hey, you're not only maybe saving money, but you're actually moving along that sustainability pathway.
What do you see are the challenges that companies face in the future?
Yeah, a lot of challenges coming at them. Regulation is coming, especially those exporting to places like the European Union will have higher regulatory constraints on products around sustainable claims. There's a lot of legislation coming around greenwashing, because you might have heard of that, where they make inflate their environmental claims that are not substantiated. So regulatory risks around that. And there's a lot of challenge, like I mentioned before, is finding the right talent to actually work in these companies and move that sustainability agenda along. So there's a lot of challenges coming at these companies right now. But what I probably want employees understand your supply chain, where your revenue comes from, and I really emphasize that in the book. Stay close to the money, because if your customers are starting to ask for this, you want to try and be ahead of that curve. So you might be the supplier of choice in the future.
Anything you would say for business who want to have an edge, a competitive edge against their competitors?
Yeah, first of all, I sort of have a saying of sort your own backyard out first. Just have a look inwardly before you go out there and push the boundaries. So make sure you do the basic things like measure your maybe carbon emissions and waste. Think about a strategy and a plan. Have the policies in place and a governance structure of how you're going to measure, report, have some responsibilities in your organization. So sort that out. Sometimes that could be quite easy depending on the size of your business. Sometimes that might take months. But if you have that foundation, then you can look outwardly focused to say, here's our competitive landscape, here's this opportunity here, and you can probably profit from those. But I would implore you to have your backyard sorted first, because you do leave yourself open to what I said before is greenwashing and it doesn't look good, and it's hard to come back from if you go out there and make a big environmental claim when you haven't actually done it yourself. So that's one thing I would really impress on your listeners to actually follow.
What are some stuff that you're working right now at the moment?
Yeah, well, I'm very excited to be launching the book tomorrow. So that's taken a lot of my time. It's taken 3 years to write. I'm working with 3 clients at the moment. One's a hotel chain in the Pacific. So next week I'm off to Tonga for the Pacific Leaders Forum, and we're announcing their climate targets there. So all the prime ministers from around the Pacific are going to be there. So that's a really great event, and they're all staying at the hotel. So I'm working on their zero waste strategy as well. So if you imagine a small Pacific island of 100,000 people, they don't have waste or recycling infrastructure. So we're going to have to look at how do we limit waste coming in, but what do we do there and turn that waste into a resource that they can use, and also look at climate change resilience, because sea level rise, cyclones are coming more common in that area. So how can they build that resilience? So I'm working with the Tongan government on that. And that's quite an exciting project to do. Here in Australia, I'm working with a utility company as they try to measure their scope 3 emissions and set climate targets. And across what they call the ditch here, across in New Zealand, I'm working with a large retailer as they set their first science-based target as well. So there's a lot going on, and it's quite an exciting space to be in, actually.
Where can people find you on social media or the internet?
Yeah, there's my author website's called leestewart.com.au. So it's leestewart.com.au. Or you can find the book is now live on Amazon. So the book is called How to Build Sustainability into Business Strategy. But if you do an author search on my name, it should come up.